It was late in Harlem, the kind of night where the streets sounded hollow and every footstep carried weight. Leather shoes climbed the stairs with purpose. Men who believed in badges and warrants didn't whisper, they announced themselves. Knuckles struck the door hard, twice, then again, loud enough to remind the building who was in charge. Somewhere down the hall, a radio murmured. Somewhere closer, a breath held. Inside, nothing moved. This was 1946, and the New York Police Department had come confident. Too confident. They had numbers, paperwork, and reasons why tonight would finally be the night. The war was over. Old protections were supposed to be gone. Harlem was supposed to fall in line. Men like this were supposed to panic, stall, beg for time, or reach for a gun. But behind the door, Bumpy Johnson didn't rush. He didn't reach for anything. He didn't even stand up right away. Silence pressed back at the officers harder than any shout. Seconds stretched. The knock echoed in the wood, unanswered. Authority waited, and waiting wasn't something authority liked. One officer shifted, irritated. Another cleared his throat and raised his voice, sharp with certainty. The words were rehearsed, practiced in precinct rooms and court hallways. "Open up, police. You know why we're here." In that voice lived the assumption that fear was automatic, that control flowed one way. Inside, Bumpy listened, calmly, not to the words, but to the rhythm behind them, the impatience, the need to be obeyed. He had lived long enough to know the difference between power that demands attention and power that doesn't. He finally stood, unbothered, adjusting his coat as if answering a knock was a courtesy, not a command. To the men outside, this was supposed to be an ending. To him, it was just another interruption. The door hadn't opened yet, but the balance had already shifted, and the question hanging in the hallway wasn't whether the police would arrest him. It was how a man surrounded by law could make the law hesitate first. Nobody kicked the door. Nobody rushed the room. The hallway stayed frozen as if time itself had been asked to wait. Papers were checked again. A glance passed between uniforms. The energy that had climbed the stairs so loudly a moment ago began to thin out, leaking away in small, embarrassing pauses. This was the mistake. The first one. The belief that showing up heavy was the same thing as being in control. They had expected noise to produce obedience, pressure to produce panic. Instead, they'd walked into a man who treated silence like leverage. Behind the door, Bumpy didn't fill the gap for them. He let it breathe. He let procedure take the wheel because procedure slows men down. Someone had to confirm a name. Someone had to reread a line. Someone had to make sure a signature matched the ink. Every rule became a speed bump, and suddenly the raid started to look like paperwork. The officers shifted again, confidence draining into irritation. You could hear it in their voices now, tighter, less certain. Authority hates dead air. It needs reaction. It needs movement. Without it, the badge starts to feel like a costume. Doors up and down the building stayed closed, but Harlem was listening anyway. This wasn't a secret arrest anymore. This was a pause long enough to be noticed, long enough for neighbors to remember who lived behind that door, long enough for a simple question to form, if they had him, why hadn't they taken him already? Bumpy understood that question better than anyone. He'd spent years turning moments like this into advantages, not by fighting, but by waiting. Waiting forces men to reveal themselves. Impulse leaks out. Arrogance shows its hand. One officer finally spoke again, louder than necessary, trying to restart the machine. The words came out clipped, official, almost brittle. It didn't land the same way. The spell was broken. This was no longer an arrest in motion. It was a standoff shaped like a checklist. They stood there, trapped by their own certainty, feeling the night tilt against them. Radios stayed quiet. No backup rushed in. Each passing second rewrote the plan. What began as a sure thing slowly transformed into a calculation nobody wanted to finish, especially not in public, in Harlem, with witnesses awake nearby people. Nothing had been resolved. That was the problem. And that was the warning. Harlem in 1946 wasn't quiet about its tensions. They lived in the air, thick as summer heat, carried between barbershops, churches, stoops, and back rooms where deals were made and remembered. The war had ended, but the city hadn't settled. Men came home expecting respect. Power came back looking to collect. Every move by the state landed heavier here where history already kept score. This neighborhood watched everything, not with binoculars, but with memory. Raids had happened before, so had promises. When police won, they won loudly. When they lost, they explained it away. What never happened was hesitation. Not like this. Not in a hallway where the pause could be heard through walls. That pause mattered because Harlem understood symbols, a door that stayed closed, voices that lost their edge, authority waiting for permission it was supposed to command. None of that fit the old script. If the police couldn't move freely tonight, then something had shifted beneath the surface, something larger than one man and one warrant. Bumpy Johnson had spent years building himself into a fixed point. Not a mayor, not a preacher, not a politician. Something more dangerous, a man the neighborhood measured itself against. His calm wasn't personal, it was strategic. And when that calm stalled the state in public, it sent a signal no speech could clean up afterward. Because in Harlem, power isn't abstract. It shows up in who gets touched and who doesn't, who gets dragged out and who finishes their drink. If the law could be slowed here, in this building, on this night, then every future knock would sound different. Every order would need proof behind it. The police understood scale in theory, jurisdiction, precedent, optics. What they underestimated was memory. People would talk about this pause tomorrow, and the next day. They'd talk about how nothing happened when something was supposed to. That kind of story doesn't stay small. What was unfolding wasn't a failed arrest. It was a public measurement. The streets were watching the state test its weight and come up light. Once that happens, balance doesn't snap back. It tilts, slowly, relentlessly. By the time this night ended, Harlem wouldn't have answers yet. But it would have a new question. And questions, in a place like this, travel faster than orders ever could. It wasn't about respect alone. It was about rhythm, about who set the tempo when the city leaned in. Harlem had learned to read pauses the way others read headlines. A hesitation could be protection. A delay could be defiance. Tonight planted a seed that didn't need explaining. From corner to corner, the message would spread quietly, reshaping expectations. The next move wouldn't be sudden. It would be deliberate, watched, and remembered. And once memory hardens, even authority has to negotiate with it. That negotiation would define the nights ahead, long after this door, this hallway, and this silence faded into history slowly. It wasn't the warrant that changed the night. It wasn't the uniforms or the paperwork. It was the tone, the way the words were thrown, not spoken, the way authority leaned forward expecting submission, mistaking volume for legitimacy. In Harlem, dignity had always been currency, and the police arrived bankrupt. When the officers finally spoke again, it wasn't procedure anymore. It was posture, a slight sneer tucked into the syllables, a reminder of who they believed they were dealing with. In another neighborhood, it might have passed unnoticed. Here, it landed like a slap. Bumpy heard it immediately, not the threat, but the disrespect behind it. He had learned long ago that law could be negotiated, delayed, redirected. Disrespect couldn't. It demanded a response, even if that response was silence sharpened into a blade. The New York City Police Department didn't understand that distinction. They treated the encounter like a numbers game. Man versus system, door versus badge. What they missed was the audience. Harlem had been pushed, policed, promised, and forgotten too many times to confuse force with fairness. Respect was the line. Step over it, and the rules changed. This wasn't about arrest anymore. It was about standing. The officers believed they were enforcing order. What they were actually doing was declaring who deserved dignity and who didn't. That declaration echoed louder than any threat. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue the charge. He didn't posture back. He let the insult hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. That stillness wasn't restraint. It was judgment. A quiet decision being made without witnesses knowing the cost yet. Because once respect is violated, retreat becomes impossible, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Backing down would mean agreeing with the insult. It would mean teaching the neighborhood that dignity was conditional, something granted by men who didn't live here. The officers felt the shift but misread it. They thought the calm meant compliance. They thought the lack of resistance meant the upper hand. In reality, they had crossed from enforcement into something personal, something that doesn't end with paperwork. Personal wars don't announce themselves. They settle in slowly. They change how names are spoken, how favors are remembered, how doors open or don't. This night planted that kind of war, rooted not in crime, but in pride. Harlem understood pride. It was the last thing left when everything else had been taken. When the police bruised it publicly, they didn't just challenge one man. They challenged the idea that the neighborhood could demand respect on its own terms. From that moment on, this wouldn't be resolved quietly. Not tonight, not soon. The insult had drawn a line deeper than any chalk outline. And once that line exists, every step forward becomes deliberate, every move measured. The law had shown its hand. Harlem, and Bumpy with it, had no choice but to answer. It was a lesson learned too late. Authority could knock, demand, and threaten, but it could not recover dignity once squandered. From this spark, strategies would harden, alliances would shift, and patience would become a weapon. The city would feel it later, long after tonight, when consequences finally collected interest in silence and in public. Bumpy Johnson had never confused noise with danger. The loudest men he knew were usually the most desperate, the ones rushing toward an ending they hadn't thought through. Real threats moved slower. They waited, and so did he. As the night stretched, his mind didn't race. It narrowed. Every emotion that might have flared, anger, pride, fear, was acknowledged and set aside like a coat on a chair. Panic was useless. Rage was sloppy. What mattered was position. Where he stood now, where they stood, and how time was quietly rearranging the balance between them. The police outside the door were counting minutes. Bumpy was counting outcomes. He understood impatience the way a mechanic understands heat in an engine. Push it too hard, and something breaks. Let it idle, and the other side starts making mistakes on its own. He thought about history, not sentimentally, but practically. Harlem had taught him that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about restraint, about knowing when to absorb pressure and when to let it rebound back at the source. The men knocking believed they were applying force. They didn't realize they were revealing limits. Inside his head, the situation wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Respect had been violated. That meant the response couldn't be immediate. Immediate responses were emotional, and emotional responses could be predicted. He preferred moves that took time to understand, consequences that arrived after the moment had passed, and nobody could trace them back cleanly. This was the difference between reaction and strategy. Reaction satisfies the present. Strategy controls the future. Bumpy listened to the hallway the way other men listened to markets. Tone shifts mattered. Hesitation mattered. Who spoke and who stayed silent mattered. Each small detail confirmed what he already knew. The police needed this to end cleanly. He didn't. Clean endings favored the system. Messy pauses favored men who could wait. He reminded himself of one rule he'd lived by longer than most of the officers had worn a badge. Never let someone else decide the tempo of your life. The moment you move on their clock, you've already lost something you can't get back. So he stayed still. Not frozen, not afraid. Deliberate. Stillness was his advantage. It made other people uncomfortable. It forced them to project intentions, to fill silence with assumptions. In that space, power drifted quietly away from them. What he would do next wasn't a single action. It was a sequence. Tonight wasn't about winning. It was about learning, about seeing who flinched, who hesitated, who followed orders without thinking. Those details would matter later when the board was larger and the pieces more exposed. Bumpy knew this moment would end without fireworks. He also knew it wouldn't end without consequence. Discipline wasn't passive. It was patient violence, delayed and precise. As the night breathed on, one truth settled firmly in his mind. Whatever happened next wouldn't be rushed, and whoever moved first would be playing his game, whether they knew it yet or not. That anticipation was the real power. Waiting sharpened it. Every second stretched the distance between appearance and reality, between what looked calm and what was being prepared underneath. When the door finally opened, the decision had already been made elsewhere. Bumpy didn't think in terms of revenge. Revenge was loud and satisfying and short. He thought in terms of position. What could be moved, what could be delayed, and what could be seen without being touched. The night had already given him the outline. Now it was just a matter of filling it in. First came patience, not the passive kind, but the active kind that listens for currents. He understood how information traveled in Harlem. A pause in a hallway became a story on a stoop. A story became a warning. He wouldn't have to say anything himself. Others would do it for him, each version slightly sharper than the last. Second came witnesses, not the dramatic kind that signed statements, but the ordinary ones who remembered faces and tones, who saw which officers hesitated and which ones pushed too hard. Those memories would surface later, when they were useful, when questions started getting asked quietly in places badges didn't enter. Third came timing. The police wanted resolution before sunrise. He wanted delay. Delay created doubt. Doubt created room. If nothing happened tonight, tomorrow belonged to him. Tomorrow meant phone calls, favors, conversations that sounded casual but weren't. Pressure applied sideways instead of head-on. He also knew how institutions protected themselves. When an arrest failed publicly, explanations followed. Reports softened edges. Language shifted. He would let that happen. Every adjustment would leave fingerprints. Every correction would contradict the last. All he had to do was remember. Bumpy's plan relied on restraint because restraint forced repetition. The police would come back. They always did. And when they did, they'd bring the weight of the last attempt with them, heavier and more visible. Each visit would draw more eyes. Each eye was leverage. He thought about who would ask questions first. Not reporters, not judges. Men inside the system who didn't like looking foolish. Men who preferred quiet authority to public friction. Those men would want this handled cleanly. Cleanly meant cautiously. Cautiously meant slowly. That slowness was the trap. By doing nothing, Bumpy was shaping everything. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He didn't need to hide. He needed the police to keep showing up, to keep proving that force alone wasn't enough here. The more they insisted, the more the neighborhood noticed the imbalance. He imagined the next knock already. Different tone, different words. More careful. That change would be the confirmation. Once authority adjusts its voice, it's already negotiating. This was chess played without a board, moves made in memory, reputation, and expectation. He wasn't attacking the police directly, he was letting their own process turn against them. Every rule they followed created another opening. Every shortcut they took created another liability. The beauty of the plan was its invisibility. To the outside world, nothing was happening. No arrests, no gunshots, no headlines. But beneath that calm, pieces were sliding into place, aligning for a future moment that hadn't announced itself yet. Bumpy understood one final thing. The men outside didn't. Traps don't feel like traps when you're walking into them. They feel like control, like persistence, like doing your job. He waited, knowing the question wasn't if the police would realize what was happening. It was when. And by the time they did, the board would already belong to him. That realization would arrive quietly, disguised as confusion. Orders would conflict. Supervisors would hesitate. Someone would suggest waiting, just to be safe. Waiting would feel reasonable, necessary even, and in that reasonable pause, leverage would harden. Files would age, memories would settle, stories would spread without him lifting a finger. By the time urgency returned, urgency would no longer belong to them. It would belong to the street, to the watching crowd, to the man who had never raised his voice. Control would slip before anyone admitted it. The first day passed without a knock. That absence spoke louder than sirens. Phones rang in offices that preferred quiet mornings. Reports were reread, then reread again. The night that was supposed to end something had instead started a clock nobody could see, but everyone felt. By the second day, Harlem noticed the shift. Patrol cars slowed. Officers looked twice before stepping inside buildings they once entered without asking. Conversations on stoops carried a different edge, less rumor than observation. Nothing had happened, and that was the problem. Authority hates unanswered space. Inside precinct walls, certainty frayed. Supervisors asked for updates that didn't exist. Legal phrasing tightened. Words like timing and optics replaced orders. The arrest hadn't failed on paper, but it hadn't happened either, and that gray area began to sweat. Bumpy waited, not hiding, not posturing, waiting the way men wait when time is doing the work for them. He understood pressure as something that builds unevenly. The side that rushes feels it first. By the third day, the city leaned in. Whispers hardened into expectations. If the police were going to move, they had to move soon. Delay started to look like weakness. Weakness invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was poison. Near misses followed. A patrol car idled too long across the street, then pulled away. A pair of officers stepped inside the building, paused on the stairs, and left without knocking. Each almost moment added weight. Each retreat rewrote the story. Inside the department, nerves showed. Someone suggested waiting for a better angle. Someone else pushed for action before the weekend. Radios crackled with unnecessary updates. The system was arguing with itself, and that argument leaked outward. Bumpy felt none of it personally. Anxiety belonged to the men chasing resolution. He focused on sequence. What came next mattered more than what came fast. Every hour stretched the distance between intention and execution. In that stretch, mistakes grew legs. Harlem counted too, even if nobody said it out loud. 72 hours was long enough for memory to set. Long enough for people to decide what they'd seen. Once decided, that memory would resist correction. The pressure peaked quietly. No alarms, no raids, just a sense that something had to give. The police needed closure. The street needed confirmation. Both waited for the other to blink. Bumpy didn't. He had learned that time favors men who don't chase it. As the window tightened, control slipped from hands that tried to grip it harder. Every plan now carried risk. Every move threatened to look like an admission. The clock didn't demand violence. It demanded resolution. And resolution, when delayed too long, starts answering questions on its own. By the end of those 72 hours, one truth was clear to everyone watching. The hunted man wasn't the one running out of time. Pressure has a way of choosing sides. It settles into shoulders, tightens voices, shortens tempers. It makes confident men double-check locks and second-guess instincts. While uniforms measured risk, he measured patience. While authority chased an ending, he let the middle expand, knowing middles are where outcomes are decided. When time is the weapon, the calm man holds the handle, and everyone else feels the blade inch closer without ever striking first. They came back in daylight, not with urgency, not with confidence, but with a stiffness that betrayed preparation layered over doubt. Cars parked where they could be seen. Officers moved in pairs, eyes forward, expressions flat. This time, Harlem didn't need to listen through walls. The street watched openly, measuring every step. The arrest was supposed to restore order. Instead, it unraveled it. Voices were careful now, too careful. Commands sounded like questions dressed in uniform. Paperwork passed between hands that hesitated just long enough to be noticed. Someone glanced around, aware of windows, aware of faces, aware that the moment had grown larger than the men inside it. Bumpy didn't meet them with defiance. He met them with calm so complete it felt instructional. No raised voice, no rush, just patience, sharpened by memory. The contrast was unforgiving. Authority moved like it was afraid of making the wrong move because it was. What followed wasn't chaos, it was collapse by procedure. A supervisor arrived and spoke quietly. Another officer checked notes that no longer aligned. Questions surfaced that should have been settled before the first step was taken. Each delay stacked on the last until the action lost its shape entirely. Harlem noticed everything. People leaned against railings, shop doors stayed open, nobody interfered, nobody needed to. The humiliation wasn't loud enough to make headlines, but it was visible enough to change posture. Authority that hesitates in public teaches lessons it can't later erase. At some point, the purpose drained out of the scene. The arrest no longer made sense to the men attempting it. Risk outweighed reward. Exposure outweighed control. The balance tipped, quietly, irreversibly. They left the way they came, but slower. No cuffs, no victory. Just the awkward retreat of a system realizing it had overreached and been seen doing it. The street absorbed that image and filed it away where memory keeps score. Bumpy watched them go without satisfaction on his face. Triumph didn't interest him. Outcomes did. This wasn't a win to be celebrated. It was a position secured. Dominance without noise, control without spectacle. The damage ran deeper than embarrassment. Credibility doesn't recover quickly once it's cracked in public. Every future move would now carry the weight of this failure. Every knock would echo differently. Authority had lost the privilege of certainty, and certainty is everything. What followed wouldn't be immediate. Consequences never are. They unfold in changed behavior, in softened approaches, in conversations that start with caution instead of commands. The state hadn't been defeated. It had been exposed. Harlem understood the difference. This wasn't the end of pressure. It was the end of illusion. The illusion that power only flows downward, the illusion that presence guarantees obedience, the illusion that fear belongs solely to the hunted. Bumpy returned to his routine as if nothing remarkable had happened. That was the coldest part. No speech, no warning. Just continuation. The message didn't need words anymore. The state had lost face. And once that happens, everything that follows becomes negotiation, whether it admits it or not. Harlem didn't cheer. It didn't need to. Satisfaction here was quieter, heavier, the kind that settles in the chest instead of spilling into the street. People talked, but not excitedly. They talked the way people do when something confirms what they already knew. Power wasn't about uniforms. It never had been. What lingered from those days wasn't the image of police cars leaving or officers looking unsure. It was the realization that dignity had weight, that when it was ignored, consequences followed, even if they didn't look like rebellion or fire or blood. Resistance didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived as refusal, as patience, as a system discovering it couldn't move the way it assumed it could. This wasn't a story about crime winning. Harlem understood that too well. The streets had paid enough to know victories were rarely clean. What mattered was the lesson underneath. When authority treats people like problems instead of participants, it teaches them to respond outside the rules, not because they want chaos, but because the rules stop recognizing them. Bumpy Johnson became a symbol in that space, not because he was perfect, but because he was disciplined. He didn't scream, he didn't beg, he didn't lash out when disrespected. He showed that control could be exercised without spectacle, that restraint could bruise authority more deeply than violence ever could. Men took that lesson and carried it differently, some with pride, some with caution, some with ambition, but everyone understood it. Respect wasn't decorative. It was functional. Ignore it, and even the strongest system starts slipping. The police went back to work. The streets went back to living. On the surface, nothing looked changed, but under that surface, behavior adjusted, voices softened, approaches shifted. Power learned it had to explain itself now. That was the reckoning. Not a reversal of order, but a correction. A reminder that force without dignity doesn't stabilize anything. It just delays the moment when someone patient enough lets it collapse under its own weight. Harlem didn't crown a king that week. It didn't declare a winner. It absorbed a truth and moved forward carrying it. And once a neighborhood internalizes a lesson like that, it doesn't forget. The tension eased, but it didn't disappear. It transformed into awareness, into memory, into a quiet understanding that power is always being tested, not by noise, but by consequence. After that week, The approach changed. They still knocked, but they no longer announced certainty. Meetings happened first, questions second, force last. Law enforcement had learned that volume created resistance here. It wasn't written in policy, but everyone felt it. Bumpy Johnson had become a variable they couldn't rush. Not because he was untouchable, but because touching him cost too much. From then on, pressure arrived indirectly. Investigations slowed, angles widened, patience replaced bravado. The system adjusted the way systems do when surprised. There were still limits, still lines, still consequences, but the old certainty was gone. That certainty had been exposed as fragile. In Harlem, fragility invites recalculation. Bumpy didn't speak about it. He didn't need to. His authority lived in changed behavior. Doors opened differently. Conversations started softer. Knocks came with explanations. That was the legacy. A man who proved that restraint could redirect a system. No speeches, no martyrs, no slogans. Just a lesson absorbed and never unlearned. Some power structures collapse when tested the wrong way. Not violently, but permanently. The police understood this one. So did Harlem. The story didn't end with handcuffs. It ended with understanding. That understanding stayed. Years later, the memory still shaped decisions. New officers heard the name and slowed down. Veterans didn't explain much. They didn't have to. Stories had done the work already. In a city addicted to force, restraint became the cautionary tale. It warned both sides. Push carelessly, and you might teach someone how to wait. Bumpy Johnson never needed a monument. He left something quieter behind, a recalibrated balance. An understanding that authority works best when it remembers dignity. When it forgets, it creates its own opposition. That lesson outlived the night, the knock, and the pause. It settled into practice, and that is why they never tried the same way again. Trying again would have meant admitting ignorance. Admitting ignorance would have meant surrendering control. So they adjusted instead, quietly. The myth remained. Not exaggerated, not denied, simply understood by those who mattered. It closed the story the only way it could, with recognition. Some men don't need to be arrested to win. They just need to be tested once. And when the test fails publicly, power remembers. After that, everything proceeds more carefully, or not at all. That understanding became the ending. It was enough for everyone involved. Silence carried it forward. Enduringly so.